So, hello everybody, good morning, and welcome back here to day 3 of the European 5G conference. It's great to have all of you back here with us this morning, and I just wanted to say again a huge thank you to all of you for all of your involvement in the event so far. I think we've been really pleased with the level of interaction, the number of comments and questions that have come in from all of you out there, and that's been a big part of the discussion so far. So we do please invite you to continue with that, and I'm looking forward to all of your comments and questions here again today. So we've had 2 really interesting days so far, and we've looked at a wide range of different issues relating to 5G policy and 5G rollout. Today we bring the discussions more focused to the issue of connectivity and of spectrum. So we've got 3 sessions today looking at various aspects, starting off in a second with a session on the radio spectrum policy program, and then 2 more sessions looking at specific bands going on beyond that. So I'd like to just start, before we start today, with actually just a quick shameless plug. As we're focusing on spectrum issues, I just wanted to mention briefly our next series of events that we have coming up, looking specifically at spectrum, key spectrum bands. So it's part of the Global Spectrum series. We'll be organising over the next 2 months 3 standalone webinars focusing on key bands, key issues ahead of WRC23. So all the information you can find on those at the website at the bottom of the page there. But back to today. As I said, we are focusing specifically on connectivity and spectrum issues today, and we're delighted to be starting very shortly with a session which is hugely timely, looking at towards a new radio spectrum policy program. Now I say that's timely because I think it was last week that RSPG, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, released an opinion focusing on the Radio Spectrum Policy Program. So we're looking forward to hearing all about that, and more broadly looking at where next with the next RSPP. Following that, we have our 3rd wave of showcase sessions. So those will be taking place immediately following the first session, and I'll be coming back with more information on that shortly. And then after that, we have a quick lunch break before we move on to the last 2 sessions of the day. First of all, session 8 is going to be focusing on the pioneer bands. So looking at the 3 pioneer bands and the progress that's been made with the allocation and licensing of those. And then after a short break, we finish first of all with a look outside the EU, looking at plans for delivering connectivity for 5G in 2 non-EU countries. So looking at the US and Saudi Arabia, we have speakers giving perspectives on that. And finally, we come back into Europe and look beyond 5G. So looking at what new bands and new connections may be available going forward for 5G and beyond. And then finally, we finish off the day with our closing ceremony. So we have some live music for you all out there. And as part of that, we're also going to be hearing from some of our speakers on conclusions and key takeaways from the conference. So please do stay for that. And I should say that the closing reception is being kindly hosted once again by AWIA, the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. So thank you very much to them for that. So a busy day ahead of us, and without further ado, I would like to then welcome to the stage our moderator for the first session, Andy Hudson. So Andy, welcome. It's great to have you here, and we're looking forward to the session. One thing I should maybe just mention beforehand is the audience polls. I'm sure we'll talk about it more in a second, but to remind everyone, we do have the audience polls once again running this morning. So please give us your thoughts on those. You can access those on the right-hand side of the screen using the polls tab there. Having said that, Andy, looking forward to the session, so I will pass over to you.
Thanks so much. Absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this morning's session. Now, we're going to be talking about the Radio Spectrum Policy Programme. Many of us can remember that first one in 2012 and the move up to that. But this is really now about a future-looking roadmap towards 2030. So how spectrum can support the wider European policies, be they environmental, be they social, be they around getting connectivity out. And we couldn't have anyone better to talk about that and to explain the Commission's thinking than Andreas. So we're very lucky to have him here, and that will be an important first part of the discussion. So with him, we want to be thinking a little bit wider around what's worked, what maybe hasn't worked so well? Why hasn't that been so easy? How do we monitor and enforce it? And we'd like to understand the recent RSPG opinion on the next generation of RSPP. And Jonas is going to give us an interview, an overview of the draft opinion. And we've also given you some questions, as Dan said. So please go on to that survey, answer those questions, and we'll weave the answers to that into the discussion we have later. So one of the things that comes up from that is what's changed? Well, maybe apart from for us in the UK, Brexit and COVID, for everybody, what are the big policy, regulatory and technological changes that mean the RSPP has to change and it's appropriate for it to? And to think about some of those things, we've got some industry perspectives. So we're very lucky to have Guillaume talking from a Facebook perspective, but also a long history in this area, and he's going to give some views. We've also got Mohamed from the ESOA to give that very important perspective from space, and that has to be a big part of 5G, 6G, and the connectivity world overall. And then we've got Stephen from Vodafone, who's going to give us a mobile perspective. And that, of course, is very close to my own heart, but also how we get a lot of these policies out. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about an international perspective. I was very pleased to see the discussion later on in the day about a US approach, some of the things they're doing there with their RDOF and CAF2 auctions, very interesting approaches to some of these problems. And hopefully we'll be able to weave some of that into the final discussion. So if I can ask the speakers to come up on the stage, and we'll start off with Andreas.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy, and good morning, everybody. Good morning from Brussels, and I would like to kick this one off by setting the scene a little bit on the Radio Spectrum Policy Program. So setting the scene for me means, first of all, to think or to mention, so what do we have? What do we have? Well, of course, we have the existing Radio Spectrum Policy Program from back in 2012, which already contained and set objectives as well as targets for the period that we've gone through now. And it was not only on electronic communication services, but also on other elements of spectrum use. Just think of Galileo, the protection of Galileo, and also Copernicus, for example. We then got or used this first Radio Spectrum Policy Program and extracted the electronic communication services elements that were in there and put those into the electronic communications code. That has been also adopted and is applicable since the end of last year. That contains the spectrum policy principles, competition, and so on. And we're currently working also in terms of 5G on the connectivity toolbox, and you've heard all about that yesterday, so I won't go into that. So that's what we have. So what are we missing? Well, in my view, we have to ask ourselves, how can spectrum contribute to the new political targets that we have? We have now the Green Deal, we have the digital decade, and all of this will also include connectivity targets. So this is an important area where we need to look to ensure that the spectrum policy is also aligned with the overall political targets that we're looking for. We also need to make sure that we are harnessing the innovations in technology. A lot has happened since 2012, and we need to also make sure that this is taken into account. Of course, 5G is a game changer. We've heard all about that in this conference. But we also have things like antenna design. We have edge computing and also artificial intelligence, which means that they can have important new impacts on the way we use spectrum and that we use it more efficiently. Also, if we come closer to spectrum elements, what has changed? Well, I think more demand is something that we keep seeing. Higher bandwidth, data rates, and so on. And this, of course, means we need to look into things like spectrum sharing in order to satisfy the needs. It's a very important element, in my view, that will also be reflected in the new radio spectrum policy program. It's a long-term goal, yes, but we also need to think about what can we do in order to get there, to make sure that this works together, that we build trials, that we make sure that we include sharing into our normal way of life in doing and managing spectrum. There's higher quality of services, more reliability. I think that we have also seen with 5G, which has moved from the B2C to the B2B markets and triggered also demand for new private local networks. I think this is an interesting development. Of course, spectrum is linked more and more to the wider digital development. We've seen that now with the, let's say, pandemic, how everything has been accelerated in terms of the way we work, the way we engage with another, and we're doing that more and more using wireless technologies. And it's not only a convenience for consumers, it's also becoming really center stage for our critical services. Of course, there's environmental and societal issues which we also need to look at, and there we need to make sure that information and facts are communicated well to the public, and we need to do more studies and measurements and things like that. So, future-proof, maybe just a word on that, because it's also, what is future-proof? In my view, it will be all about providing choice. And I don't mean choice that leads to fragmentation, but choice that is in a coordinated way. It will also be, future-proof connectivity will also be about resilient and secure networks. So we need to have the MNOs providing their services with network slices as well as private networks. We need to have different types of access to spectrum. So auctions and license exempt and license shared access. On that last point, I don't think we've done enough yet. And this is also something we need, in my view, to look at in the context of the radio spectrum policy program. We need terrestrial as well as satellite broadband. So again, this is something that is coming, and we've already heard a little bit about that on the first day. Again, something important. Last point I'd just like to mention is the governance of spectrum. We've heard that the radio spectrum decision, which was put forward in 2002, is something that is working well with CPT mandates, the Radio Spectrum Committee, and implementing decisions. We've heard that there's still some concerns about spectrum assignments. And now we have a new mechanism in place, the peer review, which still needs to show that it works. So this is a new mechanism that was set up through the Electronic Communications Code. It's with the RSPG. And we will have to see how this peer review mechanism works in order to coordinate and facilitate assignments in a way that they attract investment for the 5G and beyond 5G services. So we also may need more coordination where there is added value at EU level. And here again, there are things that we need to look at. Maybe we can go into that in the discussion as well. I don't want to do that, mention that further right now in my introductory remarks, just to say that in my view, summing up, the aim of the new RSPP should be to build on what we have, to link it, our spectrum policy, to the wider political landscape of digital, and also to facilitate and satisfy the needs that we see out there. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So perhaps we could now go on Jonas, who's going to give us a brief view of the thoughts that the RSPG have been having on this and the draft consultation, which of course everybody is going to respond to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much to Forum Europe for arranging this conference again. Before starting, I just want to do a bit of a throwback Thursday thing to approximately June 9, 2016, when we from the RSPG took the first staggering steps to set a target for large-scale rollout of 5G in 700, 3.5, and 26 gigahertz. And that target we set for 2020. We just passed 2020, and I just want to say that pretty well done. We've harmonized, we've issued licenses, many licenses still to be issued, but we've actually done a fairly good job taking it from a policy level, RSPG, into implementation and finally into services out in the market. So fairly good job done. We've heard much over the last 2 days where there are laggards in this, but just to cheer on, we're doing fairly well, many of us. So moving over to the RSPP work, and thank you very much, Andreas, for that introduction. It is now our task to sort of live up to all of those expectations. We are replying to a request for opinion from the Commission. We've had input from stakeholders, bilateral meetings with industry organizations, and also vivid discussions with member states. However, in an online format, as we all are working under. I have for this presentation 2 overarching targets. First of all, to inform you that this is going on, this is happening now. And secondly, to urge you all to respond to the public consultation, because this is really when policy is made. This is the input that we will leave to the Commission for the further development of an RSPP going forward. So I urge you to speak out now or live with the consequences. I hope that's a way to put it. So as Andreas said, we're building on the shoulder of giants, or at least on the shoulders of the code and the previous RSPP. And that's important to note, because much of what we've been saying from the RSPG has now been included in the code and also implemented over many years, but many things still remain. In this opinion, we have built it on 5 pillars, and we've tried to sort of design it as a direction rather than solution, because as soon as you start talking about solutions, you go into individual bands, individual conflicts, discussions, and different goals and targets. So we've really tried to sort of point in directions. Also, I want to note that we have been collaborating with other subgroups of the RSPG, namely spectrum sharing, additional needs, and climate change. I know that we had a presentation yesterday from the climate change group. So we try to not double work, but also look at what needs to be included in an RSPP work and what is to be in the other opinions coming out of the RSPG. Next slide, please. So for these 5 pillars, first of those is strategic spectrum issues. And as we can say, there is no more spectrum in the world than what we can measure. So how do we make it work it harder? Well, 3 ways really: move up in spectrum, share it, and award it more efficiently. So we took out sharing, as we have been saying from the RSPG for many years, that we need to get better at sharing. And the other one is on awards, where we identify different ways to look at local networks and also to see how we can sort of automate and engage in digitalization of awards. Moving on to next slide, please. We also look at spectrum needs and supporting EU vision and policies. I won't go into too much detail on this because there are quite a number of recommendations in our draft opinion on this. First of all, I would want to say that where we fail to answer to the request for opinion from the Commission is on the 12 gigahertz that we were asked to provide a plan for. First of all, approximately 12 gigahertz of spectrum is actually readily available. And there you can always dwell on the question of what is available. We say in harmonization decisions, we said identify, make available, blah, blah, blah. Is it really out there available in the market for putting up radio stations in it? That's another target. But I think that we need to stay on that and say that there is quite a lot of spectrum out there. We need to work it harder through sharing, through awarding it better, and actually putting it into the market. And also, I think that it is important to say that many of these are related to EU visions. Andreas mentioned a few of them, climate change, etc. But there are many initiatives here, and what we would want to urge, most potential spectrum-related issues are identified early in the process, because if you talk about a satellite project, that in the end, that will need spectrum. So early awareness and early inclusion of the spectrum issues in all of these going forward. Third slide, please. We then have, as Andreas mentioned, on spectrum governance, we would say that the model has proven successful, and we are quite happy with it as it works with the RSC, with the spectrum decision, with RSPG, with the CEPT, ETSI, and that spectrum governance model. So we mostly reaffirm it. We do have some recommendations on it when it comes to civil and military coordination, etc. But in most parts, we're quite happy with it. When it comes to external relations, same thing there. We see that the cooperation between member states, the European Commission, and RSPG, RSC, etc. in external relations is working well for the WRCs. We would want to stress the role of the code article 28.5 in relation to how we can use the union in relation to third countries. And also a few recommendations on other collaboration with organizations outside of Europe. So next slide, please. We also delved on a number of issues where spectrum might not be the most important part of it. We all in this conference see the world in the spectrum dimension and see that everyone else should be seeing the world in the spectrum dimension. We try to be efficient, etc. But to be very honest, there are a number of policy areas where spectrum is but a sliver in that. So we have identified a number of spectrum-related policy areas where we sometimes have a problem to delve with when it comes to EMF. Who's responsible for that? How do we work with national security, network security, and cybersecurity, etc.? And what do we do with audiovisual media policy? All of these are areas which are not 100% spectrum related, but what we want to say with this is that please include those early in discussions on those topics, and do not forget the spectrum dimension in those. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I think you've set up lots of good discussions for later on for us to into some of that. So I'd now like to move over to the sort of industry view. And if I can start with Guillaume to maybe give a view from, one of our most important tech companies and how you think about RSPP and spectrum, and some maybe comments on the points we've just heard.
Good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for having me and being such an exciting panel. Before looking at the RSPP itself and looking in the future, I thought it may be interesting to share with you my perspective on what we did in the past, what worked well, what didn't work so well. And I'd like to add two initiatives to what has been discussed before, the 5G Action Plan and the European Gigabit Society and the rollout of a very high capacity network. So first of all, let's take a moment to realize that we've had tremendous success in Europe and really great achievements. I'll give you three. And the first one is what Jonas was talking about with the early identification of 5G priority band for mobile broadband. These clear targets set early really change the dynamic, and it's really the reason why we have now an ecosystem available as soon as the mobile operators are rolling out networks. So I think we can classify that as a great success. The second success I'd like to mention is the spectrum for Wi-Fi. We're going to have a decision in the next 10 days, opening up 500 megahertz of spectrum for Wi-Fi 6E. I think it's another great success to mention. And the last one is vertical. All the member states really working on initiative, whether it's in Germany, in the UK, in France, finding out ways for local networks to be deployed to give spectrum for verticals. And the lesson that I take from that is that what works well in Europe is when we set objective. So objective-based policy actually works in Europe. That gets us to work together in the same goal and really achieve great success. Now, let's look at the other side and see at what we perhaps could have done better. And I will start with the mobile broadband. And we see that what happened is we had this great vision at European level and the priority bands. And what perhaps didn't work so well is the award at member state level. And that's where perhaps it should have been anticipated earlier, or there's something to be done in the way that Europe and the member state work together to make sure that this is more streamlined and the spectrum is available everywhere sooner. The second point is the Wi-Fi spectrum. And what we see is that in Europe, we're going to free up 500 megahertz of spectrum, which is great for Wi-Fi 6E, so basically Wi-Fi of today. But what we see is the rest of the world is going to 1200 because they want to prepare the future and Wi-Fi 7. And Wi-Fi 7 is like 320 megahertz channels. We only have 500 megahertz in Europe. So that means that our spectrum is not future-proof and is not going to sustain the evolution of Wi-Fi. So that's where, in my mind, what was missing was a clear target at European level to really go beyond that. And when it comes to vertical, we have great initiative at national level. But once again, because we didn't have a clear target and a clear band identified at European level, we see the ecosystem really struggling to develop, because at the end of the day, there's no ecosystem in Europe if it's not triggered at European level. And you could say that this is all part of us still learning to live as a union made of member states and how we can get the best of these two levels and get that synergy going instead of having this opposition. So now, turning to the RSPP, turning towards the future, I think we have a tremendous opportunity, really something which we never had before. And what I mean by that is that for the first time, at the highest level, the politic class is saying that connectivity is absolutely key to the future of Europe. So we have in our hands that everybody's telling us, please be ambitious, please drive, please lead. We're going to have by the middle of next month, I'm sure Andreas will confirm that, some clear 2030 connectivity targets. So goals that the European Union set for himself in terms of what we're going to have in terms of connectivity from mobile broadband to internet at home to internet for the industry. Not only that, but we have a great mood at this stage where the mobile operators are investing heavily in networks. We see initiatives, whether it's Open RAN or other initiatives. There's a lot of life in the connectivity business, and I think we're going a great step forward. And so how does that influence the RSPP? To me, it means we should be more ambitious and we have a chance to lead. When I look at the proposal coming from RSPG right now, I would say that I see two things. I still see some level of, okay, are we going towards member state? Are we going towards union level? And I think the answer is we should really try to go over that and get the best of both worlds, an ecosystem set at European level and maximum flexibility at member state level. And the second aspect is that at this stage in the RSPP, and it's probably just because we still don't have these EU 2030 connectivity goals, but at this stage, we don't have clear targets on what we're trying to achieve. I would call it a bit of a Me Too regulation proposal in the sense that it's saying we're going to do our best, we're going to try to use all the tools, but we don't really know what we're working towards. So my request, and I will definitely answer to the consultation, Jonas, my request would be, can we have like clear goals at European level of what we want to achieve in terms of connectivity based on the target set by the 2030 connectivity goals from the Digital Decade agenda, and say, okay, that's going to be your target for 6G, for Wi-Fi 8, for local networks, industrial connectivity. What are we going to achieve with satellite connectivity? Have these goals clearly set in 2025, mapping to clear bands, so that by 2030, the spectrum is available and we end up with world-class connectivity in Europe. And Europe leads the way instead of being influenced by the rest of the world. So that's my dream. I will answer the consultation, and I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Guillaume. And some of that nicely into the questions that we've been asking you to respond to. So hopefully that point about investment and targets and goals will feed into that. Now, Guillaume just mentioned, satellite's going to be an important part of this going forwards. So I think maybe if we could just have Mohanad to give us a satellite view and what should we be looking forward to, and how do you feel the RSPP should make sure it takes into account your industry fully?
Thank you very much, Andy, and greetings to all. Good morning from London. My name is Mohanad Jawad, and I'm here today to give you the ESOA perspective and the role of satellite in the future of 5G. Today, the Radio Spectrum Policy Programme has been instrumental in shaping the EU communication policy and setting really the direction of development of 4G networks. As we move forward and move into the 5G era, the European Commission has signaled its intention to this year establish a new RSPPP, and we've just heard the RSPG as well, for future-looking roadmaps to illustrate how spectrum can best support broader European policy until 2030. So I'm here today to present the satellite narrative. I believe the RSPPP should cover all types of spectrum use that benefit the internal market. As mentioned by the ESOA Secretary General on day one, Archie Holla, this should be reflected from a top-down approach, which means starting with the regulatory principles, policy objectives, and priorities. The RSPPP program, we hope, will enhance the efficiency and flexibility of spectrum use, as well as preserving and promoting competition. What do we mean by competition? Well, wireless technologies are becoming ever more widespread, and your mobile phone is merely one known example. Another example is Wi-Fi technology, as we've just heard from the previous speaker, used by millions for easier internet connections at home and in the office. They all depend on wireless connectivity and benefit from wireless broadband. But what about satellite? If you see the slides, I have sometimes a picture paints 1,000 words. No one can deny satellite is a wireless medium. Indeed, more and more sectors, so-called verticals, are using various wireless technologies. One example is connected cars, where vehicles increasingly use wireless technologies, for example, the radars, and in future vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, to increase road safety and eventually drive autonomously. But what if there was no infrastructure to the car? What about seamless software and firmware updates, which these cars will ultimately require? All of this can be catered by satellites today. And we will see in the showcase sessions after this session where the connectivity to cars from a satellite perspective. So the future will allow even more efficient interface between satellite and terrestrial infrastructure. Another plausible example is when we are in the air or over the water, where terrestrial infrastructure simply doesn't exist. With phased array antenna technologies, isotropic antennas, the ability to communicate with multiple satellites is the future of our sector. And to our mind, this kind of thinking reflects a change in mindset, without which we will not see a sustainable and viable 5G ecosystems, a network of network emerging. If you recall 4 years ago when we were talking about the role of satellite in 5G, it wasn't a part of the narrative. Now it's an accepted aspect and a crucial aspect of a holistic 5G and 6G future. So by changing in mindset, we mean one which embraces cross-sector collaboration because it recognizes the value of pooling and the strength of different technologies. In our view, this collaboration, especially on policy and standards, is key. And that's why we are working actively to integrate all types of satellite spectrum, C-band, Ku-band, and Ka-band within the 3GPP standard family, for example, leveraging 5G chipsets for satellite services as part of Release 17, and beyond that in Release 18. Promoting hybrid satellite terrestrial applications where ESOA members are actively contributing to the non-terrestrial network spectrum debates. I was just in an ITU meeting yesterday where this particular point was discussed, how satellite plays a role in the non-terrestrial networks. So even within the ITU, international debate this is happening. Some of the key benefits satellite brings to the 5G era, and I'm happy to see that even within the 3GPP RSPG policy areas, a lot of this resonates. For example, communication resiliency, where satellite platforms enable wide connectivity coverage and guarantee seamless service continuity where terrestrial infrastructure are not available. With the pandemic around us today, we're seeing the reliance on an infrastructure that is reliable and sustainable, such as satellite. Energy efficient connectivity. With the Green Deal, satellite nodes can be deployed on demand, reducing the operational and management cost of fixed infrastructure. Or resource optimization on parallel backhaul links, where satellite platforms offer an additional and robust channel for backhauling operations, thereby saving terrestrial resources to enable them to access traffic requests. And communications on the move. I think this is a key vertical where satellite has a tremendous area to grow. Satellite provides high-speed connectivity for in-motion terminals that cannot benefit from terrestrial coverage. And as I've mentioned, planes or vessels is just one good example. And finally, what about cybersecurity? Well, satellite is a perfect medium to operate as we adhere to some of the most robust security guidelines. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize SOA's commitment to contribute to the standardization efforts on 5G and even future 6G, especially on the integration of satellite resources and solutions and associated requirements. That's why SOA members have signed the EC Manifesto, is involved in various projects and activities in 5G, where satellite operators have a strong interest in enabling end-to-end integration of satellite into 5G and 6G to enable the use of equipment in their future networks. Finally, SOA looks forward to harmonization as far as possible the market requirements of satellite industry and providing insight into the requirements of different verticals they serve. What we would like to see is support and recognition from the RSPPP or the RSPG objectives to ensure that from the top down, an overall goal for the EU's radio spectrum policy that takes into account all technologies, including satellite spectrum needs. So with that, I end my opening remarks, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lots of really good stuff there to feed into the discussion, definitely. So the final speaker we've got is from the mobile sector. So Stephen, if it's over to you, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your perspectives before we dive into the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. And just to be clear, I'm speaking this morning in my capacity as a co-chair of one of the GSMA working groups in Europe, the FREC group, which seeks to shape policy for spectrum in Europe to make sure that our members can invest to deliver on digital objectives. So let me take a step back. What are we actually trying to achieve with spectrum policy? Of course, it's complex, it's technical, but actually our primary responsibility is to help and play a role in delivering in the digital transformation of Europe. The objectives that we're familiar with, the digital society, digital inclusion, making sure nobody is left behind, and coming shortly, the digital decade. The question really is, how are we going to make sure they become a reality? So we have already a gap in achieving digital transformation in Europe, which we need to close. But the thing that keeps me awake at night is that spectrum in itself isn't going to fix this. While we have a connectivity gap, we also fundamentally as an industry in Europe have an investment gap. Now, the European Investment Bank helpfully assesses this from time to time. Their assessment is that there is a shortfall of 250 billion euros of investment capital to deliver a connected Europe. And in fact, right now, they've hired consultants to work with some of our members to calculate exactly what that shortfall is in each of the EU 27 member states. So there's an investment gap. And the reason there's an investment gap, it partly comes down to the fact there's an equity credibility gap with investors, because we're not going to create these networks from thin air. Yes, they connect via thin air, but they need the capital markets to consider our sector, the connectivity sector in Europe, to be attractive, to draw their investment to our businesses rather than to the tech sector. So this equity credibility gap, why is there a problem? Well, Vodafone is no different from many other GSMA members. The return on capital employed for our business, we published last April at 4%. Now, our cost of capital is higher than 4%. You don't need to be an accountant to understand that investors are not going to put money into a sector where their return is less than the money they put in. So that's equity investors. What about lenders? Well, the EU telecom operators have the highest level of net debt among any other European sector, twice as high as in utilities, 50% higher than with utilities, twice the level of debt that compared to the energy sector, 4 times the level of debt for the general industrial sector, and 7 times the level of debt in the healthcare sector. So if investors don't see an equity return, and borrowers see the level of lending already extensively extended compared to other industries, where is this funding going to come from? Now, it's easy to sit back and say, well, the mobile industry should just spend more of the money they've got. If you look at capital intensity, the proportion of revenue that is plowed back into capital investment year by year by the industry, for EU operators, it's 30% higher than for US operators. And it's gone up by a quarter over the last 8 years. And that's at a time when the pandemic has driven traffic increases by 50%. So despite all of this, we have strong growing traffic. Revenues are not increasing, although I read an analyst's report this morning that said they might be up by 1% in Germany. That's hardly going to move the dial. And we've seen, in fact, revenues fall during the pandemic. So this is the investment gap that we need to solve. And as spectrum policymakers and formers, we need to play our role in figuring out how to plug that investment gap and change that equity gap challenge credibility that we have. My view, and I hope it's the view of the other GSMA members, is that as a mobile industry in Europe, we lack scale. We are fragmented. We're fragmented between member states and we're fragmented within member states. We lack the scale and the efficiency to be able to invest and to be, frankly, able to attract external investment and lending to plug that connectivity gap. So yes, there's plenty of scope for innovation, but let's make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. And unless we have an industry fit for purpose and able to draw in investment and plug that investment gap, we're not going to achieve that. Specifically, what can we do in spectrum policy? Well, there's lots we can talk about around finding future bands and the amazing work that's happening already with spectrum sharing. There is a very strong enterprise ecosystem for 5G, and GSMA members are partnering with many of those industries that are making that happen. But I would say let's make sure we're fixing the basics. We have a tremendous communications code, which aims to give all member states a target to aim for. The challenge is, are we implementing that consistently market by market, or are we risking fragmentation and distortion, excessive costs, and reinforcing that anxiety about investor confidence? And what we've seen in a number of spectrum awards over the last couple of years, some regulators create rules that aim to interfere with or disrupt or distort market competition, so-called market shaping measures, even though Article 52 in the code sets out clear conditions when this is and isn't appropriate. Some auction rules have discriminated against established operators, the ones who have been building to 98% population, despite this specifically being addressed by Article 48. And the problem of excess spectrum fees is set out in Article 42. Of that high level of debt that I mentioned earlier, 8 billion of debt in Vodafone's case comes from licenses from just the last 5 years. That's both for new spectrum and for renewing spectrum that we need to keep services connected for our customers. And that 8 billion of spectrum fees is 20% of the net debt in Vodafone's case. which concerns investors. So we're now at a position where we can make a difference, and we need to make sure we use spectrum policy to achieve that. If we don't do that, if we don't enable the private sector to be attracted to invest into the European telecom sector, the alternative is simply that we find more subsidies. Now, you've heard over the last couple of days from the conference, there is a €1.5 trillion recovery program. There's a 650 billion reconstruction and recovery subsidy fund. 20% of that will be directed towards digital capabilities. Of that, some 40 billion is expected to be directed towards digital infrastructure. That will plug 15% of the 250 billion euro gap that the EIB has already identified. We've got an 85% gap still to find, more than 200 billion euros. So let's look at how we can use spectrum policy to shape the industry and to provide that confidence that will get equity and debt funding back into the European telecom sector. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. So really good thoughts there from everybody. Thank you. And we've had some great questions in from the audience. We've also had some responses in from the poll that we sent out. So I wonder if we can just, picking up on the poll response and Stephen's comment on investment, go perhaps to Andreas and Jonas, and thinking about that sort of what's the primary means, we asked the audience, of filling that investment. And the audience said 23% for private. So only 23% think it's Stephen's problem. 30% said European funding. 47% said national funding. That's really very, very high. And I think it would be just interesting to have, as policymakers, you just pull apart a little bit that sort of sense from the room, especially with those sort of strong views from the mobile industry, and give a take on that. You know, when we think about these societal and green aims, how do we link that to funding and investment, or should we? So maybe, Andreas, if I can start with you.
Okay, thanks. What do I think about this? Well, I also find it surprising that so much is on the public funding part and not on the private funding part. I would actually argue the opposite. I would say the main element should be on the private side. We should set the right conditions so that the private investment happens. Because the public investment, be it European or national, in my view, doesn't really make a difference. The public side can only be, in a way, facilitating or triggering a little bit in one direction or the other. But if there is no demand, if there's no market behind it, it's not going to happen. So we can't keep funding and using taxpayers' money in order to make something happen, which is not happening from the market point of view. So from my perspective, it must be the private sector which does the most, and we can guide this a little bit with. Of course, we have. You heard about the investment funding possibilities that we are going to put, and that 20% is going to go into digital from the resilience and recovery fund. But still, it's only to sort of deal with things that are missing, that are the gaps, let's say, not the overall market. So that would be my view.
Great. So Jonas, maybe if you think about as a national regulator first, you're going to be putting, according to our audience, 47% of the money in at a national level. So how do you feel about that?
Puzzled. I'll just echo a bit of the words of actually both Stephen and Andreas, because, I mean, we have all set out this market to be competitive. We are holding auctions. We are enabling multiple players in the market to drive innovation, investment, coverage, service provision, etc., in a competitive environment, because that's really how we designed all of this. We didn't design it as an old PPT that is building one national network provided by sort of the government building it. We tried that method that built networks historically, but we also left that. But I think also spectrum has a big value, and I know that Stephen keeps coming back to that. In the end, that money goes into governments. So either you have some sort of perpetuum mobile that sort of turns that money around. If we look at what we've been doing in Sweden for many years, is to actually have pinpointing coverage obligations, etc., to actually draw part of that money into investment in areas where we want to sort of push the market to go into those areas, to actually create competition in areas where you previously had no coverage, to make that really a competitive edge on coverage, etc. Because then you get the demand, then you get customers willing to pay, then you get operators willing to invest. So I think, I mean, really to use the market logic to gain sort of more coverage, more investment. If you start doing blood transfusions, that might be a good thing to keep things alive. But that's really not how you sort of develop and evolve as a sort of a species. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'd agree. I'm surprised by those audience results. Guillaume, Facebook, you have lots of money. Could you help?
Thanks for the question. No, I find the discussion interesting in still opposing public and private. To take back the metaphor of the blood transfusion, of course you don't want to have someone who's always receiving a blood transfusion. You also don't want to be taking blood out of that person. So to go back to what Stephen was saying, it's important to realize that what the operators are doing is really investing in the future infrastructure of Europe. And when auction happen, I know there's a desire to get some money, but at the same time, if that money is invested in rural coverage, then perhaps it's a win-win situation where the money doesn't go out of the operator and is reinvested into the infrastructure. So I wouldn't oppose public and private, and obviously we all need to chip in the way we are. But what's important is really to go over that and look at what we're trying to achieve. And what we're trying to achieve is great services in the city center, which we have achieved through this competition scheme, and also the digital inclusion in rural. We try both. We don't need to go to the national approach to just have the rural, or go to the full private approach to have just the city center. So I'd say we need everything, and that's the issue. We can't just resume that in the black and white discussion.
I think that's exactly right. And to me, the question is, when we think about some of these societal aims, so I can understand that from a sort of investment point of view, that pure, it should be competitive and it should be in people's interest to be bidding and competing for those areas. We know that there are going to be some things, whether it's climate change, whether it's inclusion, whether it's remote coverage, that we need that partnership and we need support. What role do you think the RSPP has in trying to address that really difficult question of how much or which bits should we be thinking about having to subsidize because the market doesn't work? Or is that the wrong way of looking at it? I think maybe Stephen, if you want to come back in when you've heard a few other people's thoughts as well.
Do others wish to speak first, then I come in?
Oh, okay, well, maybe I just start because I think, first of all, it's important to realize that the RSPP itself is not going to be about money or anything like that, or about investment. So, of course, we have the Resilience and Recovery Fund and all of the things we've already talked about earlier in this conference. So what is it that we can do, of course, in the RSPP in order to make the market have an interest here? And I was talking about earlier, and I think also Mohammed already mentioned the role of satellite. And I mean, for me, I also see this. I mean, we should have the choice between terrestrial and satellite. And it will become part of the standards for 5G. And satellite is very, very prone and good in covering those areas, let's say, outside of the city centers and bridging the digital divide. reaching out so that we have social inclusion and so on. So I think that's an important element, and certainly something that we need to ensure also. And also, you know that you've heard, probably some of you have heard about the proposals of the Commission for a specific project that looks into constellation for secure communications, which is of course about resilience and secure communications, but also about commercial, let's say, broadband and so on. So this is something, you know, certainly we're ready to work together with all the stakeholders in order to make that happen, and also in the area of spectrum to make sure we are not hindering something. We're not hindering it through assignments. We're not hindering it through different fees being attached to a satellite system which should cover the whole of Europe. I mean, these are things that could be roadblocks, and we need to ensure that this does not happen, because we cannot have delays that would come, you know, to in a way of a satellite system that would allow us to achieve these social objectives that we've just mentioned.
Might just,
satellite. Oh, okay.
Thank you. No, I might just to put it in a large scale perspective, which you have to do when you're talking about an RSPP sort of cycle of decades. We come from a world where the technical efficiency of the use of spectrum was the overarching. It should be sort of well functioning on a technical level. Since sort of the 90s or something like that, we have introduced the economical efficiency in investment, in markets, in competition, etc., just to respond to the climate change and sort of the Green Deal, which is a policy area. Is it time to introduce sort of that dimension as an efficiency dimension on top of technical and economical? And that's where I see that an RSPP can actually give direction rather than solution. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may just come in on the aspect of satellite, and Andreas hit the nail on the head. When we talk about satellite, it's not a competing technology. I would look at it as part of a complementary approach within the ecosystem of 5G. I think there are key attributes where satellite can play a really, really important part, such as the ability to broadcast and the resiliency of that technology, and the innovation in satellite over the past decade or so has not only revolutionized the way we provide connectivity. For example, on the space segment, high throughput satellite technologies, non-geostationary constellations. So it's not just about geostationary anymore. Different frequency bands are being accessible. And also on the ground segment, innovation in the antenna technology, enabling in-motion devices to communicate seamlessly. And all of this needs to be integrated in the standardization, as I mentioned already. And I know there was a question about the timeline. What is the timeline of when we're going to see this? Well, currently, when we talk about the role of satellite in 5G, we are talking about the term non-terrestrial networks, NTN. And the first integration results should be published in release 17 this year, in 2021. I think there are 3 stages, and by 2022 in June, summer next year, I think the protocol coding freeze will be published as well. So we will see around that time the really new radio networks with an integrated approach of satellite. And when we're talking about the integration of satellite, it's a network management and orchestration, and not the radio access RAN layer, if you like, as part of release 17. This is happening. It's going to be the future, and we look forward to it. We see a lot of growth in our industry within the 5G and beyond era. So I think that's an exciting vertical for our industry.
And I guess, maybe to you, but maybe also to the policymakers on there, do you think the kind of thing that the US is looking at, where they're looking at effectively awarding subsidies by reverse auctions, the CAF auction, the RDF auction that have just been done, do you think that approach in the US of separating the spectrum from the obligation, in that case, the coverage obligation, is a good one or a helpful one? Because I think it's very interesting to see what satellite and other industries did or didn't win. And for me, one of the interesting things was how little the people with big spectrum holdings actually won. So how little in that sort of auction the traditional mobile operators won compared to others, whether that's cable, etc., coming in, or whether that's people using shared spectrum like the CBRS band, or whether that's low Earth satellites. So I'm just saying, I wonder whether that's something that the US is doing better than us or is doing worse than us, or whether anyone has any views on that.
If I can just come back, I will have some views on it in our later session, session 9 on this. But I believe in the traditional supply and demand equations. I think if you are going to release a lot of spectrum, you're not going to get the rewards that it's expected in the auctions. And as we've seen in the US, I believe they've released just the right amount of the spectrum, and hence why in the auctions there has been a much higher dollars per hertz, if you like, paid in these auctions, because I think they've just the spectrum just about right. And I'll talk more about that in our session 9. Is there really more need for more spectrum? Because we can't just keep going out and auctioning a lot of spectrum, because
I think this is a different question, though. This isn't the spectrum auctions. This is the auctions for coverage. So this is whether an auction is an appropriate way of seeing which industry, if you like, is the best one or the cheapest way of providing that societal aim, which in their case was to cover those areas that weren't being covered otherwise. So it's awarding subsidy, but through an auction process and letting anybody come into that auction.
Andy, if I can go back to your original question, which I was going to come back to, the question of public versus private. It's 30 years, as Jonas reminds us, since our industry, along with many other industries in Europe, was privatized. And the ambition at that stage, as Jonas says, was to establish a policy environment which would invite investor capital into the sector and carry the burden of making the investments that are needed. And what we can see today from the statistics of the sector is that no longer works. The investment sector wants to put its money into the tech sector, not into infrastructure. And our challenge in Europe is, if we're to deliver our inclusion objectives, how we change that. So the mobile industry is somewhere in the middle between the investment community and the objectives that we're trying to deliver in European society. We're not able to influence and shape, but it is worth taking direction and soundings from the investment community. As I say, they love to back the tech companies because they're scalable and have no investment associated with infrastructure. In terms of infrastructure, if there's any hotspot today in Europe with infrastructure among the investment community, it's towers. And why do they like towers? They like towers because they are unique assets with guaranteed revenues. And that's why the multiples that you apply to the earnings of towers are higher than the multiples applied to mobile operators. Vodafone is an example. By the time you take out Vantage, you end up with a service business and a telecom network business with a 5 times EBITDA multiple. And if you know your multiples, that's an extremely low multiple. So the investors are saying, I like effectively monopoly assets. I like towers because they are monopoly assets. The investor community's big concern with the European sector is our market structure. The number of players, in their view, is not right. Now, there are 2 ways in which that changes. Either there is a further consolidation in Europe, not just between member states, but within member states. And you'll have observed, I hope, the European Court's reversal of the findings of the competition assessment of the merger of two operators in the UK when it was a member state, basically saying the benefits of industry consolidation outweigh the concerns. In other words, the sector would be stronger if consolidation were allowed, clearly within competition safeguards, but that we need fewer networks, not more, if we're to drive economies of scale, but also some level of coherence that attracts investors back into our sector. So competition authorities have a role to play in allowing mergers for the number to reduce, but as spectrum policy people, we need to think about the role of spectrum licensing on creating mobile operators on the way in. And that's where we do see in some awards around Europe, particular rules which try to induce additional players into the market, which may be attractive and exciting in the short term. And as customers, we all like a hyper-competitive market with super cheap prices. But the question is, does that harm the long-term attractiveness of the sector for long-term investment? It's easy to create short-term activity by inducing extra players to come in the way in which we license, and we can benefit from short-term price disruption. But if the cost of that is longer-term investment in the investments we've identified, then we need to think very carefully about the role of spectrum licensing and policy in facilitating that.
So there's a warning in there, absolutely. I'm not sure whether that is all on Andreas to fix. I think there's a lot of competition questions in there which are possibly outside the RSPP, but I agree that there's a spectrum element and we need to be careful. I'm just taking one of the questions that we asked the room was the most important issues for the new RSPP. And we had more spectrum for European policy initiatives, was 21%. Spectrum sharing was 56%. So enormous, really strong views on that. Climate change, 7%. Cross-border of spectrum, 14%, which maybe plays into some of that. I was really surprised by the spectrum sharing bit in particular. Andreas, I'm going to pass over to you. Were you surprised, or was that pretty much as expected?
Well, I was happy to see that, because I really think this is a good sign, and I think it could be an alternative, in my view, also to what we see in the US in terms of do we need an incentive option? Do we need to sort of pit the people based on money in order to get access to spectrum, or can we find a way maybe of doing sharing that can also solve the problem? And I want to connect maybe my answer also with one of the questions I saw in one of the first questions that I saw in the list of questions, which was about sort of if sharing, yes, it's great, we talk about sharing, but what concretely? And here I'd really like to mention the mid-wave spectrum. Why? Because it's a place where I see things compounding in a way that there are needs which are clashing. There are, let's say, issues which we need to solve. At the same time, maybe sharing can help us here. And I have two concrete things here on my mind, just as a sort of point that picking up one of the points that has also been picked up by the RSPG in one of their other opinions, which is out for public consultation, and that is the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band, which is of course important for satellite, but maybe, and this is I think really an interesting one where we should look into, maybe some of that spectrum could also be for the private local 5G networks. So the local character being able to share with the satellite, which should continue to have access to the spectrum, and at the same time remove artificial scarcity, which is being possibly caused in 3.4 to 3.8 by putting those 5G local licenses into that part of the spectrum. So we remove the pressure from that part of the spectrum possibly leading to less license or lower auction fees. At the same time, we share spectrum somewhere where it might be useful, and I think that could be certainly something we should look into in detail, and a way out maybe of pitting people in an auction. And second, I have one other thing where I really see, because the sharing I think is crucial, and I think it's also something we should look at. We have this problem of the upper 6 gigahertz band. At the lower 6 gigahertz band, we will come out, as we've heard, about with a implementing decision quite soon on making that unlicensed Wi-Fi type of RLAN spectrum. But what do we do with the upper part? I don't think we need to decide that now. We also have that discussion that's coming up in the World Radio Conference on that. But would this be an area where we do of one of these, what we call, also what the RSPG calls proofs of concept, in the sense that could we find something sharing-wise that works, that includes the existing players, also those players which are interested in this from the two sides, from the, let's say, individual rights side and the unlicensed side. Can we find a license shared access approach to this spectrum where we can make, which works for Europe, and which we might also then use at the WRC to have a discussion? I'm talking only about a proof of concept, not regulation, but this is something concrete, in my view, that we could do now in order to try to bring forward sharing.
May I comment?
Before we go on to the satellite, because we could spend the rest of the time on the satellite and the particular band, can I just bring Guillaume in about, do you think that, and you talked a bit before about sort of Wi-Fi and the value of that, do you think we spend too much time looking for something in between, and we should really just say, for some things, actually just more Wi-Fi is the right answer, rather than trying to find more and more, I guess, options for sharing in the middle that are technologically hard, and maybe it's just difficult, rather like Stephen's point about why people like masts. Well, people understand it. It's a simple concept. It's easy. With CBRS in the States and things, are we right to be spending this amount of effort into these sharing regimes, or is it better to just say there's two ends of the spectrum and let's make sure we've got an adequate mix of them?
No, I think when we have clear goals, these spectrum sharing methods can be very powerful. And the first point I will make is that if you look at the unlicensed spectrum, it is always shared. There's no unlicensed spectrum, but that doesn't mean it's better. I mean, we need the exclusivity for mobile network to really provide coverage. We've been talking about coverage. We can't take the exclusivity back and ask them to provide coverage. So they need that. And when you talk about local spectrum, when you're in a factory controlling robot, I fully understand that they really want to have their license on a local basis, controlled by them for the latency aspect. So all these toolbox are really useful. I think what is useful is to think about what we want. And for example, when we have a clear goal in mind, like for 5G, we knew we wanted 100 megahertz of licensed spectrum per MNO. That's what we get in 3.4, 3.8. If we deliver that, we're on a good path to success. We should think the same way about what do we want for this local network. And I'm very happy to hear Andreas talk about just the 3.8 to 4.2, something that the UK has been talking about. If we can have this clear vision at European level of what the solution will be for this connected factory, we're on our way. And I've already made my point, but if we can have several channels of 320 megahertz for Wi-Fi 7 in 6 gigahertz, then we have our connectivity to finalize the fiber networks that are arriving at home, but also for 5G FWA. When you say you have 5G FWA to a home, you still need to distribute it within the home, and that's Wi-Fi. So I think these clear objectives that really leads to clear solution. The solution, we have a number of them, but we shouldn't focus on the solution. We should focus on the goals.
Perfect thought. Now I'm going to give everyone a final chance to comment, and I'd just like to do it in the context of Simon's question. So we've got a question from the audience. Thanks, Simon. Is this the last RSPP? So will all of these things on sharing and technology mean that we don't have to have these debates in the future, because it will all be sorted by technology and our jobs can all be done by AI? So maybe, Andreas, if we start with you.
Well, wow. I think that certainly at some stage also artificial intelligence and let's say software and so on will have an effect more than it has today. And hopefully also in the sense that it can make spectrum use more efficient. I would still think that there is a need for us in the sense of the spectrum manager who, uses the output, let's say, of the calculations that are done by AI to then also add the policy taste and the, the priorities that need to be put forward in order to bring this together. So I think we can hopefully use AI and software and all of that as a tool for more efficient use, but I don't see really that it's going to remove the need for policy. Thank you.
Jonas?
I'll try to be very brief in answering this very delicate question for all of us working with this. And the answer is no, we will not be replaced. Simon is right if spectrum was a technical issue, but as we've been discussing here, spectrum is a political issue. It has to do with different political issues and initiatives that you want to use spectrum to achieve. And just coming back to the sharing part, that's politics. What do you want to enable? I mean, we're talking about initiatives for sharing, which would be jolly good. At the same time, we're preparing for an ECC meeting where we will be discussing the 40 gigahertz band and protection at borders, blah, 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 out-of-band emissions. And we're also talking about how do we enable 5G stuff in 26, which should be able to coexist. It doesn't. And we're also talking about many other bands where certain industries and policy areas are saying that it is impossible to share. So if it was all down to technological AIs just calculating the truth, I'm all happy with that. But I don't think that will ever happen, period.
Guillaume?
It's in the same line as what Andreas and Jonas said. We need a vision. I'm very happy to hear that we're going to have the digital decade, clear vision at European level. I hope we're going to have this kind of flexibility at member state because we need both. And after that, if we get a great European quantum computer with AI to optimize the spectrum on a case-by-case basis, fantastic. But let's start with a vision. Let's bring it into the RSPP.
Great. Hannes, sorry for not bringing you in earlier with your satellite point.
That's okay. I don't know. I mean, I think there will always be a new consultation. So the answer is yes, probably. But I just want to pick up on the sharing aspects. Today, satellites we share today between us. There's no issue with sharing between satellite technology. I think when it comes to the terrestrial MNOs today, we haven't really seen as part of a policy the incentives to allow MNOs to share spectrum. I think that's something that we need to look into more carefully for efficient use, or even the infrastructure, the base stations. Today, we don't share the base stations. The notion of 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz allowing sharing there, of course, if it's possible, then by all means. But I'd like to cite the example of Germany, where they've actually allowed in the 3.7 to 3.8, 100 megahertz of local use. So I think that was a very good pragmatic example to go through. And finally, the point about 100 megahertz per MNO, is it really needed for 5G? I think it's desirable, but it's not an absolute must. You can deliver 5G technology with far less amount of spectrum, and it doesn't have to be contiguous either. So I think that's an important point to reflect upon.
Thank you. Stephen, the floor is yours to finish. And apologies, Dan, I know we're a couple of minutes.
I've got good news for everybody. The development and launch of 5G-enabled factories is happening every single day across our member states, whether you spot it happening or not. It's happening with mobile spectrum, it's happening with unlicensed spectrum, it's happening with subleased and shared spectrum. Community groups are building coverage in white spots with national spectrum. So there are all manner of sharing activities going on today already within the current arrangements. There's more we can do. Our priority is to make sure that we continue with RSPP, to make sure that we continue to attract private capital to finish the job.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Andreas, I'm not sure whether we've helped you at all in your task, but we wish you well with it. And we will, of course, all answer Jonas's consultation and make sure. I thought it was a very well point. You know, now is the time to input. Now is a great time to be able to influence this, and please do it through that. So thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Andy, thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists. So really interesting session, and yeah, we definitely could have carried on for a long time with that. So I'm sorry to have to bring it to a close. And we got through a good number of the audience questions, but again, apologies to those of you who we didn't get a chance to answer the questions. There was a huge number of questions out there. So what we'll do, if it's okay with all our panelists, if there are or some of the other questions, we'll forward to you all. So if there are any that you want to respond to personally, you'll be able to do that. So we'll hopefully be able to pass that on. But Andy, thank you, and thank you again to all of our panelists for a fascinating session. Thank you, guys. So we're now moving straight on to our next wave of showcase sessions. So we have 3 showcase sessions running now. So you can see on the screen the 3 sessions that we have. They're going to be starting in just about a minute or so. So the first showcase is being hosted by ASOA. It's kind of a satellite terrestrial linked showcase, so with Telefonica and Hispasat involved as well, focusing on connected and automated vehicles. So that's on showcase stage 1. Showcase stage 2 is a session being hosted by ITU, which is going to be looking at 5G implementation in non-EU countries in Europe. So that one's going to be starting on showcase stage 2. And on showcase stage 3, a session looking at how SES enables 5G with cloud connectivity, obviously hosted by SES. So those 3 sessions are going to be starting literally in about 1 minute or so on the showcase sessions. And then we are then back here on the main stage with our next plenary session, which is starting at 12:45. So back here at 12:45 for our main plenary session. Until then, please do enjoy the showcases, and we'll see you back here shortly. Thank you very much.